The Second World War ended in 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Cities were leveled, economies shattered, millions had died, and entire nations were bankrupt. Into this chaos stepped the United States, not as a conqueror, but as a savior. The Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into reconstruction. American factories produced weapons, trucks, and munitions. Soldiers remained stationed across Europe, defending the continent against any potential resurgence of totalitarianism. But Europe was not just physically weak, it was also politically divided. The looming shadow of the Soviet Union in the East created fear and uncertainty. The question for America was clear: how to ensure that Europe could never again fall into tyranny or collapse under its own discord. The answer came in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It was marketed as a defensive alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. The idea was simple. America would provide the shield. Europe would unite under that umbrella, deterring the Soviet Union. Initially, NATO was a triumph. The U.S. provided troops, nuclear deterrence, and funding. European nations, still recovering from war, could rely on American power while they rebuilt. But beneath this success, the seeds of dependency were planted. Europe, shielded by America's might, began to underinvest in its own defense. The foundation of NATO was solid, but the pillars of European responsibility were already weakening. For 4 decades, NATO was the central pillar of American foreign policy in Europe. American nuclear weapons were stationed in West Germany, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands. Hundreds of thousands of American troops patrolled the continent. Bases, airfields, and supply depots were all funded by U.S. taxpayers. Meanwhile, European nations focused on domestic priorities. Welfare states expanded. Free health care, generous pensions, and subsidized education were built on the implicit understanding America would pay for security. By the 1970s and 1980s, cracks were visible. NATO budgets lagged. Europe relied more on American intelligence, technology, and logistics than their own industrial capabilities. Yet political leaders in Brussels and capitals throughout Western Europe continued to enjoy the security provided at America's expense. Even when the Cold War seemed distant, NATO remained a burden for the United States. For every dollar Europe spent on defense, America spent at least 2. Presidents from Eisenhower to Reagan repeatedly warned European allies, "You must do more, or the alliance will strain under its own weight." Europe's response? Mostly polite nods. Promises of reform were made and then quietly ignored. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Warsaw Pact disappeared. The Cold War was over. NATO, however, did not. It transformed into a political and strategic question mark. For a brief moment, NATO could have redefined itself as a truly European-led defense organization. But that did not happen. European nations continued to spend well below the 2% of GDP guideline for defense. U.S. forces remained the primary shield, and European militaries stagnated. During conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s, NATO was the organization that intervened. But the European contribution was always dwarfed by American leadership, American planning, and American firepower. By 2014, Europe faced its first modern test in Ukraine. Russia annexed Crimea. NATO's European members were underprepared. They could not supply Ukraine with the weapons, ammunition, or training it needed. The United States once again became the lifeline. Massive aid, intelligence, and logistics were deployed to support European allies indirectly. Yet European governments express frustration at U.S. policy, ignoring the fact that their own neglect had caused the capability gap. Fast forward to today. European nations finally increased defense spending after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the increase came decades too late. NATO is still a framework where the United States shoulders the majority of the burden. European countries now lecture America about strategic decisions, sovereignty, and regional policy, while simultaneously relying on American logistics, intelligence, and military might. The recent debate over Greenland highlights this tension perfectly. For decades, the United States has provided protection. European governments have depended on that shield. Yet when American national interest is asserted, they publicly condemn it. NATO, once an alliance based on mutual defense, has become an organization that enables dependency and disincentivizes European responsibility. The shield is still there, but increasingly it protects a Europe unwilling to defend itself. NATO was born out of necessity, a post-World War II world where Europe could not defend itself and America sought stability on the continent. For decades it succeeded. It deterred Soviet aggression, it preserved peace. But the alliance now faces a fundamental challenge. It risks becoming more of a liability than a shield. European nations have grown used to protection without sacrifice. Strategic decisions made by the United States are criticized even though America bears the brunt of the cost. The question for the next decade is clear. Can NATO survive as a credible alliance if Europe does not assume its responsibilities? Or will the shield America provides slowly turn into a weight, a liability that the United States may eventually refuse to carry? History shows that security without investment in gratitude rarely endures. NATO's future depends not on American generosity alone, but on whether Europe is willing to stand, armed and capable, beside its most powerful ally, or whether it will continue to rely on a shield that could one day vanish.